Good morning, everybody. Thank you for attending the first of our new active, what's it called now? Active Communities Executive Advisory Panel meetings. I'm really pleased to see people here this morning. Could we have apologies for absence, please?
Chair, apologies from Councillors Harrington, McGee, Roberts, Shacklock and Smith-Haynes.
Thank you.
And Councillor Marks is here substituting.
Thank you and welcome, Councillor Marks. So we need to look at the minutes of the previous meeting held on the 9th of December. And I think I'm actually the only person currently sitting around this table who was at that meeting. So I think it's perhaps worth just taking a look at, if I can get it up in front of me, there we go. So there were some recommendations that came out of that, some actions. So I just wanted to quickly whiz through those actions. So there was one was that local ward members to be made aware of future dates and venues of the forum meetings in their respective areas. That went out, so that's been done. Then the local area partnership, insight profiles for all areas to be shared with the EAP members. I'm also aware that that was sent out and they received that information. The third action, to develop a strategy to interact with young people through both formal and informal settings. That's something that would require a larger piece of work and is there as a recommendation for us to look at as we go forward. So that's not yet been actioned. And then the future meetings of the EAP receive updates on performance monitoring indicators and outcomes. And I think as we look at our work programme going ahead, it may well be that having sight of some of those indicators and outcomes will form part of the development work when we're looking at policy. So that will be fine to bring that along. As is relevant, I think, to the discussion areas that we're looking at. I've had a look through the rest of the minutes, which seem to be an accurate report of what was discussed. So with nobody else being here, it's a bit difficult to sign off the minutes if it's just me. So we may have to see if when King arrives, if he agrees with those minutes, or bring them to the next meeting when we have more members in attendance. So unless anybody else has anything to say on those minutes. No.
On the EAPs, sorry, not the EAPs, on the local area partnerships, there was a development. I mean, I can report that Kettering Urban has set its priorities, and they are mental health and drug addiction, which we hold to be intimately linked. If people are taken off drugs and they still have a mental health problem, they will return to the drugs, and the drugs exacerbate their mental health problem. So we are actually getting on with it, and I'm told the other local area partnerships, forums and so on are also getting on with it. So progress is being made.
Yes, thank you. And we've had now 2 rounds of the community wellbeing forums and the local area partnerships. So it is really beginning to start to come together and actions, as you say, plans being brought forward for action to be taken. So it's really great to hear your feedback from your own EAP. Sorry, your own local area partnership. That's the problem, isn't it, with too many acronyms. And some people call the EAPs EAPs. I have discovered, which actually is probably better. So we'll move on then to the terms of reference that for today's EAP. Hopefully you have all got them in front of you, so really open it up to the floor for any comments or feedback on those terms of reference, please.
Thank you, Chair. Just reading through on the first page of the terms of reference, it does set out the approaches that we'll use in order to come up with policy areas. What it doesn't make reference to is, for example, national policy. So I wonder if we just include a reference to, you know, any national policy that affects the scope of the EAP's reach in that sense. I can come up with some better words outside of the meeting, but I don't want to limit us just to things like corporate plans, service delivery plans, and listening to the panel's ideas when there may be some national legislation that changes, and we think actually we need to think about how we implement that within this local authority.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Particularly, we get some really quite meaty things coming up in this area from government, and some big changes. And obviously in social care, we've got some with the Health and Social Care Act. We've got some big changes, coming down the road that have been paused, but again, they might want to be looked at by the EAP, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of other things that the government decides they want to change or give us guidance on. So I'm absolutely in agreement with that. So we can add that to those terms of reference. Were there any other points, Helen? Councillor Howell.
Thank you. Yes, it would get quite confusing with two Helens, won't it? Yes. So just on the terms of reference, obviously, I totally agree with what David has just said. Actually, we should put the forward plan in there. We should mention the forward plan in that paragraph as well, because this new EAP, the new way it's structured, is about looking more at policy and moving forward. And so not looking at papers that are coming forward. We want to get in there before that even happens and try and steer and guide and look at policies that help develop those sort of papers. So obviously some of these new EAPs have joint chairs, so Helen and myself will be joint chairing this, but it will depend on the subject matter that we're discussing at the day, because obviously if it's in regards to adults and care that Helen deals with, as opposed to myself with the sport, leisure, culture and tourism and all that. So yes, I'm afraid the members will have to get used to the pair of us swapping between the two. So, but my other point is that we need to make reference actually to the fact that some of these EAPs will have joint chairs. So where it says in addition to the chair, it could be chair or chairs. So that was just a main comment. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Howell. Those changes will be made, and your reference to the forward plan is an interesting one, because I think one of the issues is if we want to look at what's coming up, the forward plan probably needs to be populated a bit further ahead, because if you have a look, there's usually 3 months from now there's only 1 or 2 things actually on the forward plan. By the time you get to that month, there's actually a lot of things on the forward plan. So I think from our perspective, we probably want to encourage both ourselves as the executive and our officers to make sure that we are populating that plan further in advance so that we do know what's coming up. But with that, I'm happy with those amendments. And any other comments?
I just provided some prompts up there as perhaps the questions that we just want to ask ourselves around agreeing the terms of reference. So do they make sense, and are we clear on the scope and role of the EAP? Are there any elements you think should be included within the EAP tools? But also, are there any areas of crossover with other EAPs that greater clarity is needed on?
Thanks, David. I think that's a helpful steer for how the conversation on this can go. I mean, one thing that I perhaps would like to see a bit clearer in here is, it's clear in here that this body will produce advice on policy development. I'm not sure it's very clear about what will happen to that advice and how that will then, where that'll be fed to, and how would it be responded to, for example. So I don't know if people have views on how that should work.
So the way we've got it structured on the agenda, we probably should have done terms of reference after we'd done the session about setting up the EAP, because it may well be that when we work through that there will be some things that we say, actually, we need to include that in our terms of reference. Whilst they're fine as they are, perhaps we ask the same question again afterwards.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it might be worth for the first few meetings bringing the terms of reference back so that and having them at the end of the agendas so that we can just review them each time to see if they are fit for purpose, really. Maybe, you know, we do that in the first 2 or 3 meetings going forward. And having a look at the structure of the EAPs, there are going to be an awful lot of crossovers, actually. So what we need to do is always be mindful of this structure, which I think we've all had of the EAPs. And when we're discussing a topic, we should make reference to the other EAPs and whether we should be engaging with them. So maybe that could be sort of an action point at the end. If we've come up with something that we make reference, or we submit something to the next EAP that's relevant, and you know, make sure we're keeping each EAP up to speed with what's going on, and maybe get some feedback from them should that require some, I think. So thank you.
Again, Helen, Councillor Howell, I think that sounds a really sensible way forward. And as the EAP develops, developing our terms of reference to reflect how we think they should work and what our priorities want to be makes a lot of sense. So I think we can certainly action that we'll keep an eye on those terms of reference over the next 2 or 3 meetings. At the end of each meeting, review them. Are they still what we want them to be? By the end of that process, we should have, you know, very clear terms of reference that we're all happy with. So I think that's a great suggestion. Is there anything else anybody wants to add to terms of reference? And we, you know, after we've had our discussion on the EAP itself, we can go back and talk about those terms of reference again. I think that's perfectly in order. King, yeah.
Thanks, Chair. It's the question I asked before about the non-substitute executive member. Can you clarify what that is? The non-executive substitute on the terms of reference. Can you clarify what that is, potentially?
The members of the panel who are not executive members are the non-executive members of the panel. And so there is one substitute from the Conservative group, which is Paul Marks, who is here today substituting for Ken Harrington, who gave his apologies. And then there is also another substitute member for the Labour member on this EAP. So they're there for if somebody is unable to attend, they can fill in their place.
Super. Thank you, Jim. Yeah.
Councillor Howell?
Yeah, just thinking on that, it might be worth having a word with the leader to see whether we could appoint another substitute, because looking at attendance today, and these things happen, obviously people have things come up. We are a bit thin on the ground, and it might be worth considering whether we get a second substitute, considering we've got more of a number, but I'll discuss that with the leader. I think that would be easiest. Thank you.
I mean, sorry, David.
I'd probably agree with that. I mean, the terms of reference say 6 members. If you've only got one substitute for each political group, then you no longer keep your political balance, which is referenced in the terms of reference as well. So it would seem sensible that any of the substantive members, if they're not going to be present, should be able to nominate a substitute.
Yeah, I think that's sensible too. I mean, what's really important for us is to have a body of members sitting around the table able to look at and advise and help develop policy area. So certainly I think that's a great idea. And Councillor Howell, if I leave you to talk to the leader about that, and we can, if that's all good, then we can insert that into our terms of reference and nominate those people. Thanks.
That's a good idea, yeah.
Yep. Okay, so are we done on the terms of reference? Perfect. So if we can now move on to the setting up of the EAP active communities. David has produced some slides for us to have a look at. So I'm going to let you go through those, David, and I think you probably just want to generate discussion as we go through.
Yeah, very much so. So just a little bit of background and context, probably more for people who may watch this online, as I'm sure members will be very clear on how we've ended up where we are with the sort of evolution of our executive advisory panels. So a review was undertaken of both the roles of scrutiny and executive advisory panels, and has been refreshed, including some additional scrutiny committees being created as a result of that. It's changed slightly the cycle of executive advisory panels, so there won't be as many per year, but there are some slightly different mixes of the subject matters that will be covered in them. A lot of the old executive advisory panels were very much used as a clearinghouse for executive papers. So a number of backbenchers would give comment, and executive members would take that back to executive to feed into their discussions. However, that feels like more of a role of scrutiny. And a real emphasis from the executive to say, look, we really want support in helping to develop our policy direction, and we really value the opinions of other councillors who are non-executive in contributing to that. And that's where the focus of our executive advisory panel should be moving forward. Deciding on policy development, so again it sets out in the terms of reference that can be done through looking at the corporate plan, looking at service delivery plans, but also members of the panel bringing their ideas around potential areas where they would like to see policy worked on or developed. And we had the discussion a little bit earlier on about perhaps including reference to the council's forward plan, and also to changes in government legislation or policy that may influence us as a local authority as well. Just to be clear, EAPs are not decision making, but should help the executive members to shape their thinking around policy development. I think the key to us getting that right is going to be agreeing how we will work as a panel together. And I would probably describe the previous EAPs as quite formal, bringing papers, going through papers. I've put a bit of a question mark around, do we still want that formality, or do we want it to be a little bit less formal, more discursive, so that people can have more of a conversation around thinking?
Thanks, David. I think this is a really important point, because there's an element to which you sort of you're feeding things to people and almost directing them into the way you want them to respond, and how you want the conversation to go. That's the very formal process of delivering a paper. So you go through that paper. It's hard necessarily to think about beyond what's in that paper and expand on it, or be particularly imaginative, because you're being given a, pretty much, this is what we want to do, what do you think? So personally, I want this EAP to be very different to that. I'd much rather it was very much an open discussion. But at the same time, I do realise that within that there needs to be something for us to discuss. So there need to be some ideas at least to be presented, but not presented as a, this is what we want to do. So I think, again, it's if you come in with nothing at all in front of you, yes, you can start a conversation. And maybe that is right, actually. Maybe you start and you say, okay, we're presenting you with nothing, but this is what we want you to talk, this is the area of policy we want to discuss. And then it may be at a future EAP, you say, right, this is what you said to us, and here, this is what we thought you said. now what do you think of the thoughts on this piece of paper, and you know, where do you want to take it from there? I don't know, but I know that it can be very hard for people to start talking about something if there's nothing at all in front of them in the first place. So it's a bit of a balance, I think, of, you know, not bringing a fait accompli to you to look at. Yes, please.
Councillor Harrison, I wonder, would it be helpful if then officers brought something which, as you say, wasn't a fait accompli, but was more about background and context and discussion points, so that it at least got that discussion going? I mean, it may go much more wide-ranging and go a different direction than anyone expects, but at least that would be a starting point and give you some of the factual context for the discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Shirley. I think that's a great idea. David?
Thank you, Chair. I wonder if it might be helpful if, because both of you as executive members will have things that you've got in the back of your mind around what we'd like to do over the next year, whether we almost work through one and say, well, what would we expect officers to bring to that discussion? So, Councillor Howell, you will have something along the lines of a tourism strategy, or so what would we want to do around that? It might be that you want some background information, what have other areas done, but what you don't want is us to come with a tourism strategy and say, do you like it? Because that's, so it's about getting that balance right. So I wonder if we took a couple of items and almost worked through in our minds, what would we expect? Because this is probably the sort of thing which I'd be saying. You want a few, you know, points to point you in the right direction, but then it starts the discussion and gets people thinking around, okay, what can we add to that?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, totally agree. I mean, at the moment, a lot of us executives are going working with officers to develop plenty of strategies. I've got one going on that's sport and leisure, and another one that's tourism strategy, and then we've got to look at a cultural strategy. So I've got strategies coming out of my ears at the moment. So yes, but yes, it would be good for members to engage and understand what those strategies are, how they're expected to be developed, what they entail, how long they take. For instance, the tourism strategy, you're having to deal with a lot of key stakeholders who will feed into that strategy. We also have to work with government papers such as the Dubois Review that outlines how they want to take tourism forward and how the funding structure will work in the future. So, yeah, there's a lot of background papers that can be brought forward with that to give a steer on what direction we're going. We're also doing consultations online. I'm not sure if members have seen this, and we've got the tourism hub in Rushden Lakes. So to be able to inform members of exactly what's going on with that and how the strategies are taking shape would be a really good idea from my perspective on my portfolio. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Howell. And I think you know, in terms of the types of things we might want to bring for discussion, where we are now bit is quite helpful as well. So this is where we are. And then, as you say, what are other people doing? What's, you know, what sort of scope do we want to look at? So there's something to give us a starting point. And I also think something that'd be really useful would be, when we're looking at development of these strategies, is being really cognizant of how they help to deliver other things as well. So, you know, if you're talking about your tourism strategy, it absolutely feeds into, economic development of the area, which admittedly is looked at by a different EAP, but we should all be looking to, as a whole council, how do we enhance other parts of the council. So I think referencing that's quite important. It'll come into all sorts of different bits that we look at. So I think that's great. I've got two other people, then I'll come back to you if that's okay. King.
Thank you, Chair. I think you're absolutely right. This point of discussion is brilliant. Why? Because we've gone through the sort of the papers and we're scrutinising the papers, and we almost end up crossing over scrutiny. And I think this forum, EAP, developing policy and sort of almost shaping the executive's mind around what our constituents may be saying, ideas coming from us, etc. A sort of a blank, open forum. It should be what would be my suggestion. Ideas don't necessarily have to make it into the papers, but at least it would, you know, help shape the thinking around a particular area within this EAP. So, I mean, I like what Councillor Howell said around the understanding what the strategies are as a whole. It's always good to have the background, but I think this particular, from my sort of personal opinion, would be good if it was completely, this is the idea, maybe a few points, let's sort of discuss and see where we get to, and what ideas are brought forward to add to the policy formation.
Yeah, thanks, King. I think that's a point really well made. I think anything that we do that would constrain the debate and the development would be counterproductive. So I think you're absolutely right that we should give only as much information as helps for that very free-flowing discussion and debate and development, rather than trying to direct you down a particular path, which I think can be quite tempting. But I think I think it would be somewhat of a waste of time if we just come along basically trying to say, look, here are our ideas, tell us you agree with them, because that's not really going to make this EAP very valuable. I've got John Ashton on the screen, wants to speak. John, over to you.
So, Helen, I think what I'm hearing is there's kind of a number of phases to this. So there's like the initial situation analysis. There's then the framing of it, including the cross-referencing to other directorates and policy areas. And then there's the progress side. And then there's the option appraisal at the end where, you know, there's a chance for members to influence actually what the decision is with regard to different options. So I think it's possible to chunk it up into discrete phases.
Yeah, thanks, John. I guess that's right, and I think what I think we've got to be careful of is that, because at the moment it is suggested that we have a meeting every other month, and I think that if we took a phase per meeting, you know, we'd end up looking at very, very little. So I think we've got to make sure it's slick and we are genuinely getting ideas through and dealing with. Well, sorry, I'm rambling a bit, but when I first started talking to people about this, I kind of thought in each meeting we'd probably only look at one topic, because it would, you know, you'd start talking and, you know, a couple of hours of a meeting, you're pretty much only going to get through one thing. But if we were going to do it where we chunked it up, as John has just described, you might end up having to do it differently, where you've got a couple of different things on train at the same time. Otherwise, you're not going to get through very much business and development of policy. So, again, has anybody else got any views on that? Because I just want to make sure that this, you know, it actually produced this. We actually produce some recommendations, and we don't spend so long doing it that we never get there. I suppose that's my point. David.
I think the methodology that John's described is right, but whether the EAP does all of that is the question. So what I would suggest is the EAP's role is very much to inform the starting point of that. Officers would then work with their executive members to bring forward the options appraisals that go to executive at a later date. But what we will be able to do is then show, well, these were the discussions that we had at our EAP. You can even append it to your options appraisal, and this is how it's informed the development of the options that we've got. So we have to be careful that EAP doesn't do it, because that's what we take your strategy, and as officers we implement it for you. We design and implement. So that's the way that I'd suggest it would work. But absolutely, the methodology that John's described, I think situational analysis and the cross-referencing happens in your EAP. The next bit around moving on to the options appraisal happens outside of that and then informs what gets presented to executive. Does that make sense, John?
Yeah, I think the framing is important as well. You see, you take the example of the leisure one, which has been mentioned already. What's been important in those conversations has been to frame the leisure strategy as not just being about bricks and mortar, but about, more people more active more often, and how do we make maximum use of the natural estate as well, and people's opportunities to be active, travelling to work through walking and cycling and so on. So, taking a whole systems approach which has linkages into other policy areas. So the framing is important quite at an early stage, so that you don't finish up with something that's too narrowly drawn.
Yeah, perfect, and that makes absolute sense. And so now I begin to sort of feel like what would happen is we'd have these discussions here in this EAP, and I would guess again, just for feedback, once the work by officers and executive members has taken place, prior to that then going to as a formal paper to the executive, it ought to be reported back here to say, look, this is the work that you guys did, these are the thoughts and ideas you had, here's where you can see that reflected in our new policy. And if there were some strong suggestions that don't make it into that final policy, is explaining why that wasn't done and why it didn't fit or whatever. Because again, I think I always have this view that people need to know the value of their input, and if you don't, you just feel like you're coming to talk and you never really know the value of that. So I think that would start to become a feedback part of the EAP as well.
Charles,
yes,
so that's okay through you, Charles. You took the words right out of my mouth. Absolutely spot on discussion, EAP recommendations brought forward to the next EAP, and we can then, continue to discuss any other topic. That would be the ideal EAP in my view.
Lovely. So, David, did you want to carry on going through your slides that you produced for us? Oh, sorry, Helen.
So, yeah, thank you. If we're taking, as I said earlier, the sort of tourism strategy as a sort of an example, which is obviously started already because it started just before we've set up these EAPs. As part of a strategy, you have to go out and consult with an awful lot of different people. We take the sports, leisure, how many clubs, how many open spaces, how many organisations. But I see this EAP as being part of that consultation period. Do you see where I'm coming from? So this EAP feeds into that consultation, and that helps develop and mould the strategy as it moves forward. And then, as you were saying earlier, once the strategy is nearly there, that's when all the feedback comes. I'm just taking that as an example of a strategy. We're going to have an awful lot more of things to discuss other than strategies, but as part of all of these strategies, there's an awful lot of consultation. And we should also, on this EAP, be encouraging everyone and anyone to be a part of the consultation, because we promote them online, we promote them through Facebook, website and everything. So as a group, we can feed in, but also as individuals, we can also feed into that strategy. And I think taking on board what members say in these EAPs as part of that strategy moving forward, I think that's really valuable.
Clearly, this is a form of consultation, but I think I'd like to see it as being a bit stronger than just another consultee. The people round this table are elected members who are here to represent their areas and their constituents, and I think there's a subtle difference between what this group is going to be doing and a consultee, because consultees tend to fill in a very formal consultation document with specified questions and so on. This is going to be different. So although it clearly is a consultation, I mean, you can't say we're not consulting. I think it's slightly different.
We're actually on the same wavelength. Please don't get me wrong when I mean that we just want a bit of input, and that not at all. From my perspective, what comes out of this EAP is absolutely valuable in structuring it, in structuring all of these strategies moving forward. And maybe the use of a consultee is the wrong word. A fundamental part of the strategy moving forward, I think, is probably the easiest way to say it. But so that's how I see it. That we are able to be at the beginning of these things as and when they're happening. And I think as we've already got one going forward and we're partway through, I'd like to get some feedback quite early on in this process that we're doing now, because that strategy is due to be completed in March. Whereas, so from my perspective, we're looking at the sport, leisure, and that'll take over a year to do, because that's seasonal. You have to look at sport and leisure throughout the seasons. So that's fine. We have time to do things like that. But some strategies are going to be time restrictive, so we have to make sure that we are bringing them into our work programme and having a look at them as early as possible and being able to feed into that process as well. But it's also understanding from the government papers the direction in which actually the government want you to travel, not necessarily which I as the executive want. They have structures and they have ways that they want sort of tourism boards and funding boards who collect the funding and then distribute it, how they want it set up. But do you see where I'm coming from? So actually what we will be saying will feed into that, but sometimes there is a structure that you have to follow as well. So we just need to be mindful of that. It's quite difficult.
Yeah, I understand. I'll come to you in just a sec, David. I think that brings up a really good point, actually, about how strictly some of these policies are determined by what the government says we should be doing. Because if there's very little scope for us to actually do things imaginatively or differently or whatever, there's probably not, there's less point sitting around the table discussing it if it's pretty much the government's directing you down a particular path and you've got to do it that way. So I think that's something we should think about in terms of what we bring forward. Because it's not much point sitting here saying, well, the government says we've got to do that, so tick, yes, we've got to do that. And I'm sure the strategy has way more scope than just that. So that which is great, but it's just again something to keep in mind when we're looking at what to bring forward. If we are very constrained about what we can do, there's not much point sitting around the table spending hours talking about it. But David, I think I'll come to you in a second, King.
No problem.
If we just we've just consulted on a strategy, and by the time it got to an EAP, it was pretty much shaped. So I would suggest what we're trying to do is move to a situation where you've got the seed of an idea, where we then work with the EAP to say, we've got this idea, we want to test it, we want to see what you think about it and what strong views you've got on it, because that was very much done by officers with our exec member, and we could have done all of the bits that we did with Councillor Harrison, but with our EAP, we could have shown given them the information about the buildings that we've got, about how our carers are currently trained and paid at the moment, and then discussed what we were thinking of doing and tested those ideas. That could have then shaped the final document that we did consult on. That's where I am. So I think you are saying the same things. I think because you're a little bit further down the line with your tourism strategy, it'll be different when it comes to your leisure one, because you've got that period of time to do that engagement and to bring the ideas and the thoughts to the EAP.
Yeah, and you're referring to our provider services adult social care strategy. And actually, I still think there's scope for us to look at that, because we're pretty certain, we've got pretty much a plan for phase one, but there are other phases of that which I think would be really interesting to bring to this EAP to look at. So, even when you've got, an agreed overall strategy, there's still quite a lot to formulate and work up within that. So, that's something I'd quite like to bring. But King, you wanted to come in.
Yes, thank you. So I think it's a difference between being part of the sort of the inaugural stage, the ideas like you mentioned, or being at the end, just being consulted and adding a few bits in. And I think I'd want to see us on this end of the stick help to shape the policy, the ideas. But then also there's a wider tourism strategy, for example, but then there's loads of different subparts within it that may need feeding into and ideas created. So although there will be that overarching strategy, you'd expect that from a council for them to have strategies, at least a sort of provider services, tourism. But then EAPs and the councillors can sort of feed into all of those different subsections that can absolutely add value as well. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, King. I mean, yes, Councillor Hackett.
So you're absolutely right. Obviously, once the strategy is done, a strategy is a document that's created by an external body, because we employ people to do that. They produce a strategy, then that will come back to us. And, there will be elements of it that are quite open-ended as to, they give you a steer on what sort of direction you they think you should go in, but also then that's a decision that we can feed into as well. So actually, we can feed in at the beginning, and also once the strategy is created, to interpret and move on that direction going forward. Thank you.
I was going to say as well, which I forgot to say, there are some things which is led by government that are fixed, and there are some things that aren't. So we can be a bit more imaginative. That's all. Thank you.
Thanks. David.
I think that's a really good idea there. If there are external consultants, we could invite the external consultants to the EAP, and they can present what will essentially be the straw person of what a strategy may look like, and they can engage with people that know the local area, know the local attractions, and some of the less known attractions as well, because that's a big part of tourism, is people like things a little bit off the beaten track as well, don't they? Not just, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's been a really good discussion, and it's really beginning to crystallise what this should be doing. I think if I can try to summarise, essentially, this EAP wants to be involved on the ground floor, as it were, to be very early in the process of developing strategy, and to be a fundamental part of the thoughts and ideas that then go forward to become that strategy, which would then be consulted on. So there's that sort of difference between the formal consultation and what this is. This is very much driving what ultimately ends up being consulted on, and that we should be feeding back to this group when that policy is pretty much in shape, to say, look, this is what you said, this is how the policy is developed, and so on, and that there are quite a lot of there are different ways in which we can bring information to this group, depending on what's appropriate at the time. So, for example, as you said, if there's a formal, if we're having external people writing that strategy, we might want them to be here in an early discussion before they've even begun to write that strategy. It may be that we, as we said, we sort of bring some background papers and say, okay, now open to you. Let's see where this goes, and so on. So I think we've got a pretty good idea of how we want this to work. And I think that perhaps brings us to the end of that first slide. We perhaps need to move on to, so we've talked about how we'll work, but one thing we missed out was the fourth slide, which was about going back to those terms of reference. So given that discussion that we've just had, is there anything else that we think ought to be different in those terms of reference or added or so on. It looks like, David, did you want to speak?
I think it's that bit, so if there was ever a criticism of the previous EAP, it's we don't know what's happening. So how will we measure that we know the EAP is working and achieving its aims? And some of that might be, well, if we've got that feedback loop, that may be sufficient and we build that into the process. But is there any other way that we can measure?
Well, just a thought. Sometimes we don't have to have numbers on a piece of paper to prove that things have happened. What about an annual review by the EAP of how the EAP has worked? And I mean the non-executive members of the EAP saying, okay, this year we looked at these this subject matter, and this is the impact we think we had. And if the EAP members come back and say, we don't think we've had any impact at all, I think you can safely say that the EAPs haven't worked. So I don't know what you think of that as a feedback mechanism as to how well the group is working. King.
Well, thank you, Chair. I think that's a fantastic idea. We can review it annually, but then also as the recommendations will be brought forward to the next meeting, in which if we're going to be doing that, we discuss something, bring it back to the next meeting. This is what's been recommended. I think also that's a good gauge throughout the year as well, bi-monthly. Yeah.
Sorry, John.
So I think that's an interesting observation, Helen. I think it raises the question about qualitative measures as opposed to quantitative measures. And if we are looking at implementation and attainment against the overarching goals of the council, and some of the things within that we've touched on this morning about how any particular initiative speaks to cross-council things and gets the synergy. So there's probably a basket of half a dozen qualitative things to capture in that kind of review, quite apart from any quantitative measures that might be appropriate.
Yes, thanks, John. That's really helpful. I think that's absolutely right, and that's something that we can develop as we go forward. But I think you're absolutely right. It's really important that I feel it's really, really important that we show the value of these meetings, and that our non-executive members feel valued and part of that process, and that they're genuinely making a difference. I know that some members have felt, of the EAPs as they were before, that really they weren't, achieving that much. So I think having some review that shows that has had an impact is really quite important. So thanks for that, everybody. So we've gone through the slides. We've talked about the terms of reference. Made some suggestions for some changes, so we'll keep. And King, you came in just a little late, and we were just talking about we'd probably just keep bringing the terms of reference at the end of the first few meetings, just to say, are we still happy with these? Are they doing what we want? Are they reflective of what we want to do? Yes, go for it. Shirley.
Thanks, Councillor Harrison. I'm probably nitpicking here, but item 14 talks about agendas and reports, and I think the discussion has been very much about this isn't a paper-led a meeting. And I wondered, because the word reports suggests something very formal, whether it just says agendas in any paperwork, because that way you're still getting information, but it doesn't lead you to think that it's back to that very formal meeting with formal reports.
Anybody else have a view on that? I think it's a valid point. It does make it sound very formal. Anybody, David?
I'd agree with what Shirley said there. If we truly want this to be about almost being co-design of strategy or policy for the local authority, if there's an expectation for officers, which is why I had the question, what do we want officers to do, to bring a written report in a standard format then that constrains the conversation, the earlier discussions that we had. So I think what we don't want it to be is a talking shop. So there has to be something that comes out of it at the end. And I'm trying to think what that might be, a sort of, rather than being minutes, it's probably more a, this is, you know, it's a, this is the, you know, the crux of the conversations that we've had, and this is what we want officers to do with it, and how we're going to take it forward. And then you can almost look back at that and say, yes, that's happened, this has happened, a paper's now going forward to executive, and we can see that it's been informed. So I'd agree if we could make it a little bit softer, so that actually it enables, because it, you know, it might be that what we say is we want to go out on a bit of a field trip and have a look at something. Why not? We did it with the Levelling Up scrutiny review. So there's opportunities for us to do that, and you might, you know, Councillor Howell may have, you know, thoughts around the playing field strategy, and say, well, let's go and have a look at some of them. Let's see what the challenge, because for me, going out and clapping my eyes on it and having a look and getting a feel for the place is equally as important as reading words in a report.
I mean, papers could read something like discussion materials, or something like that. Councillor Howell.
You're probably just about taking the words right out of my mouth, actually, and the reason I think you're absolutely right, and associated documents or something along those lines, because if you think about, and I keep referring because it's just an example to the tourism strategy, well, a document that we would need to take in a digest would be the Devoir review that outlines the way a strategy and how a tourism offering should follow, basically, and that is a government document. So we would probably have to look at that government document to see what they want from it and how we can sort of embed our thinking into how they want it. So do you see what I mean? So you would have to have some associated paperwork, background papers or something like that. Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right.
Joe, I mean, I concur with all that David has said, and absolutely. And I think we can arrange a field trip to Chester House.
Where we can go and have a nice cup of tea in the cafe. Fine. I mean, that's great. That's been a really good and valuable discussion. And I think what's really nice is that there's a huge amount of consensus around the table as to what it is we want to achieve, how we want to word that. You know, I've been through terms of reference on many occasions and had some very dry discussions. This has actually been one where the terms of reference has actually sparked, you know, quite a lot of really interesting discussion, even in terms of just how we word it to make sure it absolutely reflects what it is that we're going to be doing. So I think that's really, really great. Is there any further comments on that before we move on basically to start to think a little bit about what we might want to look at as a priority? I've got a feeling I might know what it is. But anyway, I've got the forward plan in front of me here. It goes through to May of 2023, and as predicted, there's just budget stuff in the May 2023 forward plan. So there's nothing, I don't think, there for us to get excited about. Lawrence Sidra. In the April, there's nothing that would... It's coming too soon. So I think, looking at the forward plan, that there are some bits that are coming to the March meeting, but that is far too soon, and it would be very much just looking at papers as we've done before. So I'm not sure looking at the forward plan at the moment, because it's not populated far enough ahead, is going to give us a steer. I think what's probably more beneficial is to think about the strategy areas and the policy development that we think we would like to look at. Helen obviously has talked already about the tourism strategy, which is something that is in train already, and you said it's going to come, it needs to be prepared by, did you say March?
We are looking to have the strategy completed by March, but then once that strategy is proposed by the consultant, obviously at that point then we've got to start looking at how we implement the strategy and take it forward. So actually, I think if we wanted to have a look at the way we're shaping tourism, that would be good, because we've got till March till it's prepared. We can start thinking about engaging with the consultants. We actually have a meeting on Monday. We have a strategy meeting at Chester House on Monday where all of the stakeholders are feeding in. So I suppose members of this panel could come along to that meeting at Chester House if you wanted, and get an idea of what's going on, and then think about popping it on the plan for forward, so that that at least will give you an idea of where we're going with it. If you want to put that strategy on your work plan, that would be useful for members, I think.
So non-exec members, is that something that you would like to look at? Would you like to be getting in and putting your... Yeah. Okay.
So I can organise an invitation to come out to the EAP members to attend that workshop. That would be useful. Thank you.
Okay. King.
Just a question, actually. I'm just looking through the forward plan. There's a procurement of home care service for North Northamptonshire. I wonder, given my business relationship, will I be involved in that if it was to come to EAP? Because I've got a business, and we obviously tender to the council.
David.
So I wouldn't necessarily be suggesting that something like the re-procurement of home care comes to the Executive Advisory Panel,
right.
Because it is a cycle of things that we have to do from a contractual perspective. What may be more appropriate, so I've asked our Assistant Director for Commissioning and Performance to think more about how we widen the market of providers that we've got, to include things like community interest companies, absolutely, personal assistants, micro enterprises. So I think as we start developing ideas around that, that would be something which would be good to bring. So we might bring a wider social care market development item to this EAP, but we're not, we spend millions and millions of pounds every year on domiciliary care. We need to make sure that the contract is procured and that cycle is met in that sense. It's not going to dramatically change unless we were to really address our market position and commissioning intentions, which are the bits which I would say should come to something like an EAP, because that shapes your thinking. Absolutely. And future procurements.
Thanks,
Yeah, thanks, David. I mean, that was my view as well, was that it's not really something that I think we could really sink our teeth into as an EAP particularly. One thing that, as I mentioned earlier, we talked about the fact that we have just consulted on our adult social care provider services strategy, and that part of that is possibly about to get underway, the first phase of that, depending on our response to the consultation. But then the second phase is very much around our younger adults services, and I think that might be an area that'd be really good to look at, because there's quite a few moving parts in that. There's quite a lot of scope for looking at doing things differently to the way we do that now. So that might be something that you want to look at. I think I'm right, David, in saying that we spend more on younger adults social care than on older adults. Am I right? Or or it's maybe 50-50?
It's about the same.
Yeah. So, because when we talk about adult social care, most people think about the over 65s, and they don't realise this huge amount of work with our younger adults. So that might be something that you're interested in looking at.
Can I jump in? I think younger adults, through your chair, require a wide range of care variations to keep them active of mind, but also their care package is slightly tailored, where you get older adults that have a fixed 4 calls a day, 3 calls a day, or whatever. A lot more flexibility goes with younger adults, and I think the community interest groups and community associations, such as there's a plethora of them, community hubs, can really help to support younger adults. And I think that sort of thing will be good for the EAP. And I think because I don't work with younger adults, I can get my teeth stuck into it as well.
Okay, thank you. From an officer's point of view, obviously you've got quite a nice global idea of things that are going on in your areas. And Shirley, you came up with some thoughts about other things that we might want to look at. Did you want to feed those through and see what the members thought about that?
Yeah, one of the things I wondered if members were interested in is looking at health protection. So how we manage infectious diseases, etc., because the landscape has changed quite a lot in the last 2 to 3 years. It's still full of moving parts around what we have to deliver, what we can deliver, what we could deliver, and what the national picture is. And UCSA is going through the government body that oversees health protection is going through changes itself, so it's quite a shifting landscape, and I think it would be good for members to understand that, because it's not just about COVID-19, it's lots of health protection areas and vaccinations, etc. And we have communities in the local area who perhaps are vaccine hesitant. So there's just lots of things in there that I think with Northants Council's public health team would probably value your input, and also it would provide you with information. I think there are some other topics which I will probably feed through around, I'm thinking, mental health and some of the activity of the place-based labs, etc. I think there's some scope there for influencing that.
Yes, Councillor Howell.
Yeah, thank you. When these EAPs were put together, we had this sheet actually, which is quite useful because when we look at our key corporate priorities and key priorities, that we've got 5 categories in which this EAP perhaps should focus on, think about. So one is greater access to better quality adult social care, value and support our carers and volunteers, improve the accessibility and use of leisure, culture, art and sports, provide enhanced support to improve mental health and well-being. So these are sort of the areas and topics that we can look at, and tackle the cause of complex problems such as poverty and homelessness. So that it might be worth sort of picking up on those corporate objectives as well, that where we can focus on what we're looking at. So maybe we want to have a look. I'm happy to pass that down to you, Helen, if you want to have a quick look.
Yeah, thank you. John.
Yes, so thanks. Just to follow up on both those points, Helen. I think what we're trying to develop now for Northants is a concept of wider health protection. As Shirley says, I mean, historically, health protection has tended to be seen as rather narrowly about infectious disease, but the concept in modern public health terms is quite a lot wider than that. So it extends to community resilience, linking over to emergency planning and contingencies at the neighbourhood and local area partnership level. It links across to violence prevention, which is a public health responsibility, but which is very much of a partnership agenda. And also the aspects of prevent and the terrorism and other acts of violence, often stimulated by social media nowadays at an individual rather than at an organised level. And trading standards work, I'm thinking here particularly about the growing problem of use of vapes among teenagers and the role of trading standards. These are just some examples. So I think it would be good to get non-execs on the same page of understanding what a broader approach to health protection looks like, because it's really cross-council.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I guess, though, what I'm hearing is almost like bringing stuff to the EAP to aid understanding of what something is. What I can't quite hear in that is what the expectation of the EAP is in terms of developing or that work or that field, or how we deliver that in the council. Is that what you're thinking, Shirley, that there's a role for looking at how we bring all that together and try to shape the way we deliver that in the council?
In essence, yes. So it's about understanding what the opportunities are, and as John has just said, the widening of that role and where the connections are and how the council can take advantage of that, what you feel we should be doing, where you feel that, you know, that isn't where the focus needs to be. So it's shaping that service as it's set up and as it develops.
And I think
it's about the unknowns, Helen. There's getting everybody on the same page so that people can see the opportunities within their own areas and how they link across to others. So that that's a gender setting thing, really, because otherwise the tendency will be to do business as usual rather than developing, you know, things in a way which would be much more imaginative and would stand a chance of putting the authority on the map nationally.
Yeah, thanks, John. No, that's really good. And I think for the sake of our non-exec members, our Northants public health team is very much in the stage of development. It had only just been disaggregated, so it's now separate from the West public health team. So if we did look at this as a piece of work, you would absolutely definitely be getting in on the ground floor at the very earliest stage of developing that piece of work. So, yeah, having discussed it, I think that is a good idea. But interested in the views, yes. Councillor Marks.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chairman. As we all know, these subjects are all interlinked. I mean, for example, physical exercise can have a link into mental health. So if you do not physically exercise, you end up an unhealthy fat lump like me. And that can have a knock-on effect on mental health. It can actually, some people, quite seriously. So I think all the different subjects in the portfolio are actually linked. They might think, how is tourism linked to health? It is linked.
Yeah, absolutely. Point well made. Sorry, King and then David.
Thank you. And just before I follow on from what Paul's just said, which I think is a fantastic point, there's these in terms of health protection, Chair. There are in terms of shaping the sort of the idea from the beginning, developing policy. There's these gas canisters. You see these sort of silver things all over the place, and surely, and what I hear from younger sources, my PA being one of them. She doesn't do it, but no, what she told me about it, just to make that clear. Did they use a balloon to inhale this, whatever it is? That surely could have a huge health consequence to their brains and things like that. And it's about what younger people are doing and what they're getting into, and how we can prevent that and add it into their ideas. It's not just vaping. There are things like this. But just on what Paul said, I think is absolutely right. Things like a particular strategy of sports, which I think will be linked, because sports is both health and recreation and leisure, could be something in which I'm sure a number of non-executive members have a raft of ideas. I know I do, and I think it'll be good. Thank you.
Super, thank you, King. David?
Some really good suggestions there. I think one which was inferred in there, but I think we should be developing a North Northamptonshire carer strategy as well. So we're still working to the old county-wide strategy at the moment. And when you start thinking about the other strategies coming there, so you've got leisure tourism strategies, those things can help carers in their caring role. So how do we make connections between them? And I think that's where the exciting stuff from EAPs can come, is about making the connections between there. And as we develop our tourism strategy, you know, working with our partners to recognise that actually we've got probably about 30,000 carers in North Northamptonshire, of which we probably know somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 of them. But how do we support them by accessing different facilities, either with the person that they care for or as a break in that sense? So there's some real opportunities to think about that moving forward. I've already talked about care market development, and we've touched on issues relating to children or young people in that sense. And one of the big ones which comes up in the media a fair bit, and I don't know whether so you probably need to look at your list of different EAPs, but and whether it comes into ours or whether there's a specific children's and families one. But you know, the fascination with social media. I mean, I know, you know, as a 11, 12-year-old, you didn't see me at home. I was out, you know, kicking a football, riding a bike, climbing trees and falling in streams. And our kids aren't doing that now. So this is an active communities, but we've got a whole new community where that isn't a part of what they're doing. So just really interested in, does that fall into this area? And if so, how do we influence it? Or is it in the one which Scott chairs? Or
yeah, actually, when I think it would fall into our area, because the future communities that falls into Councillor Edwards' area is predominantly about sort of education, special ed needs, provision for disabled children, young offenders, and employment and skills. So I think from an active lifestyles sort of perspective and getting them out there, and that, I think it would fall under ours from as a leisure and sport. And so I think yes, that's something we definitely could. I'm sure we can consult with them anyway.
Yeah. I think that's right, because as you say, from the active communities point of view, it absolutely would fit. From the public health aspect, it absolutely would fit. And I think the way it could be managed is we could say to the executive member for children's educate, whatever his title is, there's at least 4 things in there. You know, we're discussing this at our EAP. If you'd like to hear about what was discussed, or if you'd like to actually attend and listen, or even take part, please do. So I think we have to allow there's some flexibility, because we know that everything we do in the council touches other parts of the council. And everyone will be bored silly of hearing me say that I want this to be a public health council. I believe that pretty much everything we do, most of what we do is public health in one way or another. And so it's difficult not to touch on other things if public health is part of what we're looking at. And just going back to David's point on a carers strategy, I think that would be brilliant to bring to this. And I was thinking we could bring Northamptonshire carers to come and speak to us, for example. So some really quite nice ways of we could engage as this EAP. So I'd really welcome us bringing the carers strategy to this EAP. So it sounds like we have quite a number of topics, and what we're going to need to do now is decide how we want to, you know, what do we want to bring as a sort of priority. David wants to come in, so I'll just hand it again.
Sorry, John's just put in the chat that active communities is also about active citizenship and volunteering. Volunteering can be a positive mental health thing. Giving is one of the 5 ways to well-being. So recognising that when people feel that they have a role, a contribution back to society, that can support the growth of their own well-being as well.
Fantastic. So I suppose the difficult bit is saying what are we going to bring to our next EAP in whenever that is. King.
I think as a priority, what David was just talking about with the social media and kids not necessarily doing that community, I would love to see that at a future, well, soon EAP.
Okay, so I think that topic is it's about engaging children in healthy activities and helping to move them away from unhealthy activities. Is that roughly what that topic would be looking at? So it's very much, yeah. So it's a combination. It's quite nice actually because it's a combination of public health and the you know, leisure and sports and all those sorts of things. So it does bring quite a lot together in one package. So is there sort of agreement that that's something we could look at our next meeting and bring some thoughts to that?
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right. It does encompass, I mean, when it could start feeding into the very basic start of the sport and leisure strategy as well, obviously moving forward. So actually they will feed into each other. If members are inclined that we bring this tourism strategy through as well, because we can quite rapidly engage with that now, I would suggest it would sort of start the process rolling and get our teeth into something as it's moving really rapidly. I think that might be, we should pop that on the to-do list as well if everybody thinks that that's worthwhile.
That's great. And sorry, just another thought, because this is another one of these little things that buzzes around my mind quite a lot. It was actually stimulated by David a long time ago, so it's really his idea, not mine. But I've never been able to quite let go of it. But and John mentioned volunteering, and so there's quite a lot you can bring together in one particular topic. And I'm thinking about our young people's topic that we want to talk about. I've had really, David's had this idea, and I've kind of run with it, that if we can get young people involved in volunteering, there should be a quid pro quo that, you know, perhaps they earn credits for volunteering, and as a result, they're able to have a free swim session when they've got enough credits, or that kind of thing. Somebody I was talking to recently who works with children a lot, you know, she really poo-pooed the idea of youth clubs. She said children don't want that. They want to go to the gym. Now, I don't know if she's right about that, but, you know, giving a bit of a reward for having done something good and worked in your community, which is good for your mental health, it's good for your learning and development, you know, and then being able to do something healthy as a response to that. Go to the you know, go and see something at the Cube downstairs in the theatre. I wonder if that's something we could bring into that as an idea as well. So we're sort of bringing lots of elements together in one discussion that might be quite valuable.
Just add to that, I can absolutely agree. And I think, so kids, yes, they don't just want to go to youth clubs, particularly the older ones, they want to be out playing sports. So I think encouraging sports is something in which we can also bring to this young people. I think that we're developing a session and how we do that. Do we need more astroturfs and better lighting so they can play sports and five-a-side and things like that? So I think a sports strategy for young people would be fantastic to in the discussions. Thank you.
Great. See, we're already beginning to discuss it before we've even got there. Councillor Howell.
Sorry, I know this seems to just open a Pandora's box here, doesn't it? Because actually, when you're talking about the youth and doing that and engaging them with sports and volunteering and everything, but also we have the other side of it, which is arts and culture and heritage, and we have so many fantastic play spaces around. I mean, you look at Chester House, for instance. We have on the books, we have 250 volunteers. You know, we can engage with children to be a part of that volunteering programme that we have running throughout the whole of Northamptonshire. And I think that would be really, it encompasses everything, doesn't it? So I think that's really positive. suggestion. I'm really pleased that we're looking at taking that forward.
Well, that's great. I think we've got our early topics that we want to discuss, and we're already champing at the bit to discuss them. David, I think you just wanted to come in.
I'm always very conscious when us middle agers start talking about children and young people, that fine with doing it as a subject, as long as it's the start of a conversation that then involves younger people in it further on, if that makes sense. Because I know that my kids would cringe if they thought I was solving their problems for them.
I'm only 31. Just
That makes you middle-aged in the eyes of a child, I'm afraid. No, I absolutely agree with you, David. And actually, it takes us back to one of the action points from our last meeting, which was how do we engage with young people and bring them in and they become part of designing and being involved in this process. So we perhaps need to think about how we do that. It doesn't sound necessarily that simple because there's different groups of people all over the place. But I think we should look at how we start the thinking. How do we then engage with young people to say, is this even what you would want? Okay, well, I think we've done really well. Given that we didn't really quite know exactly how these EAPs were going to form themselves and what was going to happen, I think we've really. We've nailed how we want them to work. We've nailed how we want them to be fed back, which we will develop over time, and how we want to evaluate them. And we have already got ourselves 2 clear topics that we want to look at: the tourism strategy and the sort of I don't know how to describe it in one word, but encouraging healthy behaviours in young people. Maybe that's I don't know quite what it is. Maybe that's a really bad way of describing it, but those 2 topics. If everybody is happy, I think the meeting is closed. Thank you very much, everybody.